The wind in Alaska has a sound that can't be described by words alone. It doesn't just blow, it speaks, dragging through the spruce trees and over the frozen ridges, echoing through the hollows, slow, ancient whisper. In those sounds, some men hear warnings, others hear peace. For one man, a man who had left behind everything that used to define him, the city noise, the faces, the clocks, and the screen. The wind became a kind of companion, a presence that told him he was exactly where he needed to be. His name doesn't matter much because in the quiet of the Alaskan wilderness, names tend to lose their importance. But for the sake of this story, we can call him John. John was not the kind of man you'd find on the covers of magazines or in survival. He wasn't chasing fame, nor was he running from the law. He was just searching for stillness, a kind of silence that city life had slowly stripped away from him over the years. His cabin stood deep in the interior, days away from the nearest road, built by hand over 3 winters. The logs were rough and uneven, but strong enough to keep the cold out, the warmth of a small wood stove inside. The door, heavy, old, and made from the thick boards of a retired fishing dock, was his pride. He had salvaged it from a small coastal town before moving inland, believing it carried a bit of the ocean spirit with it. It was solid oak, weathered by salt, and heavy enough that even a gust of mountain wind couldn't shake it. But one day, that door would become something far more important than a barrier to the cold. It would become a trap, a last defense between a man and one of Alaska's most dangerous predators, and not just once, but twice, in the most unexpected way. Most people think they understand fear. They think of dark rooms, breaking news, or the threat of losing what they love. But fear in the wilderness is different. It's a quiet thing. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It waits behind the trees in the sudden silence of birds or in the low crunch of snow when you know you're alone. John had learned that the hard way. The first year he lived there, he had encountered moose and wolves, storms that buried his cabin up to the windowsills, and nights so cold his breath froze before hitting the floorboard. But nothing compared to the presence, that primal force that reminds even the most prepared man how small truly. He had seen bears before, at a distance, lumbering shadows near the river where he caught salmon. They usually wanted nothing to do with him. But that changed one late autumn morning when food was scarce and curiosity became hunger. He had been splitting wood behind the cabin when he first noticed the sign. Deep tracks in the snow, larger than any he'd seen before. The claw marks carved into a nearby tree told him it wasn't a passing wanderer. This was a bear claiming territory. For most people, that would have been reason enough to pack up and leave. But for John, leaving wasn't an option. The river was freezing over, supplies were limited, and winter was coming fast. You don't just abandon months of work because a bear shows up. Out here, the land doesn't forgive weakness, and fear is something you have to learn to live with, to respect, not run from. He decided to reinforce his cabin, sealing the cracks, checking the hinges, and setting up a few old traps near the tree line. But deep down, he knew that if the bear truly wanted in, no wall of wood could stop it. That night, the wind howled harder than usual. The moon hung low and orange behind the trees, and every sound outside felt amplified. The fire inside flickered low, and John sat in silence, his rifle leaning against the wall by the door. He listened for hours. Then came the sound, a slow, deliberate push against the outer wall, the sound of claws on wood, a growl so low it seemed to shake the floor. John stood frozen, every muscle tight. The bear was outside. It circled the cabin, sniffing, testing. And then came the sound that would stay with him for years, the groaning creak of his heavy oak door as something massive leaned its full weight against. John grabbed his rifle, but even with it in his hands, he knew it might not be enough. If the door gave way, it would be him or the bear, and there wouldn't be much time to think. What happened next was partly luck, partly instinct, and partly the strange kind of wisdom that only comes from isolation. As the bear pushed harder, the door began to bend inward, the old hinges straining under the pressure. John knew it couldn't last much longer. In that moment, he noticed something, the way the bear's weight shifted when it pushed, how it leaned its head and shoulders into the top corner of the door, forcing the latch to creak open just slightly. John waited until he felt the neck surge, then threw his full weight against the other side, slamming the door shut just as the bear's head pressed through. The door swung like a trap, the heavy frame catching the bear's head and shoulder between the thick wood and the outer wall. The sound that followed was a roar. It shook the night. The bear twisted and thrashed. The old oak held. The latch jammed deeper into place under the strain, locking the beast halfway in. For several long minutes, the two were caught in a brutal standoff. The man inside, gripping the rifle he hadn't fired, and the bear outside, trapped by the very thing it had tried to break through. It took hours for the noise to stop. When morning came, the bear was gone, leaving deep marks on the ground, splintered edge on the door. John stepped outside carefully, his breath fogging in the cold air, and saw the trail of blood leading into the wood. He followed it only far enough to know the animal had survived. It had learned something that night, and so had he. In the wild, survival isn't about strength or bravery. It's about understanding balance, about knowing when to fight and when to let nature teach you what it means to endure. That door, once just a barrier against the cold, had become a lesson in instinct and patience. He fixed the hinges, reinforced the frame, and went on with his life. But deep down, he knew that the mountain had only begun testing. Years later, when the story of that night had become just another quiet memory, it happened again. The same door, the same cabin, the same kind of silence before the storm. But this time, the bear was bigger, older, maybe even the same one, returning for a second chance. John had aged too, his hair grayer, his hands rougher, but his spirit unchanged. He knew the mountain would always test him in new ways, and he out here ready. You don't live against nature, you live with it, even when that means staring into the eyes of something that could end you somehow through wisdom, instinct, and maybe a bit of luck. The same door would save him once again. That's the strange beauty of solitude. It gives meaning to things that most people overlook. A door isn't just a piece of wood. It's a symbol of boundary, protection, and the thin line between life and death in a place like Alaskan. For John, that line had become part of his story, a story that began with a man seeking peace and ended with him finding a deeper kind of connection to the wilderness, one forged in fear, respect, and survival. As he often said later, the mountain doesn't care who you are or what you've done. It only asks one thing, that you listen, because those who listen survive. If you've ever dreamed of a life alone, free, surrounded by the raw truth of nature, take a moment and imagine it now. The cold air biting at your skin, the smell of pine smoke in the morning, the silence so deep it feels alive. And if you can feel that pull even a little, tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes the wilderness isn't a place, part of us, waiting quietly the right moment to be heard. Before John ever found himself building that cabin deep in the Alaskan wilderness, before the snow and the silence and the heavy oak door that would one day save his life, there had been a city, a family, and a kind of noise that never stopped. He had lived the way most men do, chasing things that never lasted. There were bills, meetings, long commutes through crowded streets, and endless small distractions that pulled at his attention until the days began to blur into one another. He had once believed that was simply how life worked, that exhaustion was normal and silence was something you had to buy in small pieces on weeks. But then came a day when everything stopped making sense. It wasn't sudden, not like the crash of an avalanche or storm rolling over the mountains. It was slower, quieter, like the slow erosion of a riverbank, barely noticeable, until one morning you realize everything that anchored you is gone. He had worked as a mechanic for most of his adult life, fixing other people's machines while his own life broke down piece by piece. His wife, Laura, had once loved the way his hands smelled like oil and pine soap. But as the years passed, the distance between them grew until it was measured not in words, in silence. There were arguments about money, about time, about how he never seemed to care about what the future looked like. She wanted movement. He wanted stillness. And in the end, that difference was enough to break everything apart. When she left, she took their daughter, Emma, who was only 6. That was the last time he truly cried, now, not from anger, but from the understanding that he had built his life around things that could vanish overnight. He spent a year trying to fix what was broken. He called, wrote letters, sent gifts that came back unopened, but nothing changed. The city began to feel smaller, the noise sharper, the faces more unfamiliar. He started walking at night, sometimes for hours, wandering closed shops, empty alleys, listening for something he couldn't name. It was during one of those walks that he first thought about leaving, not for a vacation, not for a change of scenery, for something deeper, a return to a simpler kind of living, something closer to the rhythm of the earth itself. He began reading about Alaska, about the people who had built lives far from the grid, living on what they could grow, catch, hunt. The idea started as a whisper in his mind, then a dream, then a plan. It took him 3 years to make it happen. He sold almost everything he owned, stored what little remained in a friend's garage, and took a one-way trip north. He wasn't running away, at least not anymore. He was walking towards something that felt like truth. The first time he saw the Alaskan wilderness from the small bush plain that carried him inland, he felt the weight of his old life fall away. Below him stretched a world untouched by roads or fences, where rivers carved their own paths and mountains decided their own. It was terrifying, beautiful in equal measure. When the plane landed on a frozen lake and the pilot waved goodbye, John stood there alone with 2 crates, a pack, and the strange, exhilarating knowledge that there was no going back. The first winter nearly broke him. The cold was merciless, the nights endless, and his own body unprepared for the constant demand of survival. He burned through his supplies too fast, underestimated how quickly snow could bury a roof, and learned that solitude was not the peace. There were moments when he thought he might die, not for cold, the silence. Yet each morning he woke up, started a fire, and kept building. The cabin became his purpose, one log at a time. By spring, when the first green began to push through the frost, the place felt like home. The land didn't welcome him exactly. Alaska never will, but it accepted his persistence, and in that acceptance, he found the peace he had been searching for over time. All along, he stopped thinking in hours and minutes. Time became measured in light, in the length of in the sound of the river thawing. He learned to hunt and fish, to track weather by the scent of the air, to move slowly enough that he began to recognize as something more stranger. It was then, in the quiet routine of that he began to understand what solitude really meant. It wasn't loneliness, clarity. It was the moment you stopped needing the world to validate your existence, because the mountain itself does it for you, simply by allowing you to. Sometimes, when the nights were long and the wind turned the sky into a constant hum, he would think about Laura and Emma. He wondered where they were, if they were safe, if his daughter still remembered the sound of his voice. Once he found a small, smooth stone near the river that reminded him of one Emma had kept in her pocket when she was little. He kept that stone on the shelf above the stove, a tiny fragment of his old world watching over the new one. It was enough, not to replace the past, but to honor it. He didn't blame them for leaving. In truth, he had left long before they did. He had been there in body but absent in spirit, already drifting toward the mountains he didn't yet know he needed. When people think about isolation, they often imagine emptiness. But for John, isolation became fullness, the absence of noise replaced by a presence of meaning. He began writing in a small journal, not to record the days, but to understand himself. The entries were short, sometimes just few words. River low today, snow came early, saw tracks near the ridge. Scattered among those notes were reflections that revealed a deeper transfer. Fear doesn't disappear here. It becomes part of you. The mountain never lies, even when it kills. Peace is not comfort, truth. Those pages, now weathered and stained with smoke, told the real story of his life more than any photograph. Years passed quietly. His beard grew longer, his face more lined, but his eye clearer. He built tools from scrap metal, learned to smoke fish properly, and repaired his cabin with the kind of care a man gives to something he intends to die beside. The door, that old oak slab from a forgotten dock, became his daily companion, opened at sunrise, closed at night, its hinges creaking like an old friend clearing its throat. He talked to it sometimes, half in jest, half in gratitude. That door had kept out wolves, wind, and the kind of loneliness that tries to creep in during long winters. It was only later that he realized it would also become his protector in ways he could never have imagined. Before that night, before the bear, before the roar that split the silence, there was something else, a storm that nearly cost him everything. It was late March, the transition season when the ice begins to melt, but the cold still bites. He had gone out to check his traps near the river when the temperature dropped suddenly and a heavy snow began to fall. Visibility vanished within minutes. He lost the trail back, his footprints erased faster than he could make new ones. For hours, he stumbled through the white blur, exhausted, his compass spinning from the magnetized minerals in the ground. When he finally saw the shape of his cabin through the storm, he dropped to his knees in relief. That was the night he promised himself he would never take the mountain for granted again. Survival, he learned, isn't a single act of strength. It's a daily conversation with nature, one where respect matters more than courage. Looking back, John often said that the hardest part wasn't the cold or the hunger. It was the weight of memory. The quiet has a way of pulling old ghosts from the corners of your mind. You can't hide from yourself when there's no noise to drown you out. That's the real reason he stayed, not to escape others, to finally face himself. The mountain, for all its beauty, is a mirror. It reflects exactly what you bring to it. And if you come with anger or regret, it will show you those things until you either accept them or destroy you. In time, he chose acceptance. He stopped asking why things had happened the way they did and started asking what they were trying to teach him. He never remarried, never sought company beyond the occasional visit from a bush pilot or trapper passing through. Yet, he didn't see himself as lonely. He had the river, the trees, the sound of ravens in the morning, and the feeling of belonging to something vast and alive. The wilderness didn't need his approval, and he didn't need its permission. It was an agreement of sorts. He would live humbly, take only what he needed, and the land would let him stay. That simple, ancient balance became the foundation of his peace. Sometimes, when he looked at the horizon glowing orange in the late Alaskan dusk, he thought about what life might have been if he'd stayed in the city, the traffic, the arguments, the endless search for meaning, and he would smile, not out of arrogance, gratitude. The pain that had once torn his life apart had guided him here to a place where he could finally hear himself think. Every scar, every mistake had been necessary. Without them, he might never have found the silence that became his salvation. It was that silence that taught him how to listen, not just to the wind or the river, but to the subtle rhythm of itself. Out there, alone among the mountains, he began to understand something few ever do, that isolation doesn't take something from you. It gives something back. It strips away everything unnecessary. All that remains is truth. And for John, that truth was simple. Peace isn't found in what you add to your life, but in what you're willing to let go of. So when the day came, the bear returned. The same door once again stood between him and the force of wild nature. He was ready, not because he was stronger, because he was finally aligned with the rhythm of the mountain. Every moment of pain, loss, silence had been preparing him for that test, and this time he would face it not as a man trying to survive, but as a man who finally understood what it meant to belong. And if you've ever felt that pull, the desire to start over, to step away from the noise and find out who you really are beneath it, maybe John's story is speaking to you for a reason. Sometimes the mountain isn't a place you move. It's a decision you make inside your. And when you're ready to listen to that call, life has a way of leading you there. If you feel that truth stirring somewhere deep in you, take a moment and subscribe, because this journey is only beginning, and the silence has more to say. The silence of the mountain not empty. It has layers, textures, and mood. In the beginning, John had thought of it as absent, the absence of traffic, voices, and all the clatter of civilization. But as the months passed, he began to understand that silence in the wilderness is a living thing. It breathes with the forest, hums with the snowmelt, sighs through the pines, and shifts with the wind. It can be warm or cold, heavy or light, welcoming or cruel. It was within that ever-changing silence that John began to truly live, to find rhythm where others would only hear stillness. Every morning he woke before dawn, when the stars still clung to the sky. He listened. That was how he knew the day's weather before seeing the sky, by how the air sounded when it moved through the valley, by the tone of the ravens calling in the distance. It became his language, one he never learned from any man but from the mountain itself. The routines of solitude are what keep a man alive. In places like that, John had learned to measure his days not by what he maintained. The fire must never go out. The tools always be sharp. The woodpile must stay high, and the traps must be checked before the light fades. Each task was a thread in the fragile fabric of his survival. He found comfort in the repetition, in the quiet discipline of tending to simple things. There was something sacred in making coffee over a wood stove, in splitting logs while the frost still clung to the trees, in washing his face with water so cold it stung him awake. These small rituals became his prayer, his way of saying thank you to a land that asked for nothing but respect. Winter was the hardest and most honest teacher. When the sun barely rose and the cold pressed against the walls like a living creature, John learned what patience really meant. There were days when he didn't speak a single word, when the only sound in the cabin, the soft crack of burning wood. He found that silence stripped away the noise inside him too, the doubts, the regrets, the restless. Alone in that, with the snow piled high against the windows and the wind howling outside, he faced it in ways he never. There was no one left to blame, no distractions left to hide. But the mountain forced him to be honest. It demanded it. He learned that peace isn't the absence of struggle. It's the calm acceptance. He kept himself busy. He built things, shelves, a new table, a small smokehouse by the creek. Each piece carried the mark of his hands, a slow mastery born not of skill, but of patience. He made mistakes, too. Once, he cut his palm deep while carving a handle, and the nearest help was days away. He stitched the wound himself, using fishing line and a sewing needle, his hands shaking but steady enough to finish the job. It left a scar that he would often trace later, not as a reminder of pain, as proof that he could rely on himself completely. In the city, people depend on systems, electricity, water, food delivered by someone else. Out here, dependence becomes something you hold in your own too. The animal became his neighbor. He learned the paths of the moose, the nesting spots of the eagles, and the tracks of wolves that passed through at night. Once, he found a fox watching him from a distance, its fur like fire against the snow. For weeks it lingered near the cabin, sometimes taking scraps he left by the edge of the trees. It never came close, never trusted him fully, but that silent companionship meant more to him than most conversations he'd ever had. In the wilderness, connection isn't built on words. It's built on respect. You learn to exist alongside the wild without trying to control it. Food was always a test of resourcefulness. In the summer, he fished the river, catching salmon that ran thick and silver beneath the clear water. He smoked and dried what he could, storing it for the long months ahead. He foraged berries and mushrooms, learning the difference between what could heal and what could kill. He planted small patches of potatoes and hardy greens near the cabin, not much, but enough to remind himself that he could create as well as take. There was no waste. Bones became tools, fat became fuel, and nothing was ever thrown away without purpose. Living like that taught him humility. Everything in the wild costs something, and nothing comes for free. At night, after finishing his chores, he would sit by the fire and write in his journal. The words were simple but heavy with meaning. Today I saw the river breathe steam at sunrise. Heard wolves singing near the ridge. It didn't sound like danger. It sounded like prayer. Sometimes I think the mountain listens when I speak. Those lines, scratched into paper yellowed by smoke, carried the essence of his transformation. Over time, he realized he no longer needed to escape anything. The silence that once frightened him had become his friend, his teacher, his mirror. He didn't think of the past with regret anymore. The world he'd left behind had taught him how to build, how to endure, but the mountain was teaching him how to be. One evening, while watching the sunset bleed gold across the snow, John thought about a strange trade he had made with. He had given up comfort for freedom, noise for meaning, company for clarity, and yet, standing there with his breath turning to frost, stillness wrapping around him like a blanket, he knew he had gained more he'd ever lost. The mountain didn't promise safety or success. It offered truth. It was worth everything. There was a serenity in knowing that every decision mattered, that every mistake was his alone. In a world where people are taught to chase more, he had learned the art of enough. Occasionally, when the weather allowed, he would hike to a nearby ridge that overlooked miles of untouched valley. From there, he could see the river winding like a silver thread, the forest stretching endlessly, and the distant peaks cutting into the sky. He would sit there for hours, saying nothing, doing nothing, just existing. It was during those moments that he felt closest to understanding something he couldn't quite put into words, that the mountain wasn't just a place, but a state of being. To live there was to surrender, to stop trying to bend the world to your will and instead let it shape you. The longer he stayed, the more he felt himself becoming part of it, like another stone, another tree, another quiet breath in the endless rhythm of nature. Isolation also taught him gratitude. Every sunrise was a gift, every meal an achievement, every warm night of fire quiet. He learned to find joy, smallest thing, the sound of snow sliding off the roof, the sight of a moose crossing frozen river, the smell of pine resin on his These hands. Moments, insignificant to most, became his wealth. He didn't need much, and that was the point. The less he needed, the freer he became. He often thought that if people could experience even a single day of true silence, not just the absence of sound, but the kind that lives and breathes, they might begin to see the world different. The seasons came and went, each leaving their mark on him. Spring brought mud and promise. Summer brought light and labor. Autumn brought reflection. And winter brought endurance. He had become part of that cycle, moving with it rather than against it. The solitude that once seemed harsh softened into belonging. He no longer counted the days. Life in the mountains wasn't about counting, it was about being. He wasn't surviving anymore. He was living deeply and fully in a way that few people ever do. But even in peace, the mountain always keeps a challenge hidden. waiting. The quiet life he built wasn't without its danger. The wolves were clever, the weather unpredictable, and the bears, always the bears, reminded him that no man is ever truly safe out there. It wasn't fear that kept him sharp. It was respect. He knew that nature gives and takes without emotion. The same river that feeds you can drown you. The same snow that protects your roof can crush it. The same silence that heals you can also undo you if you stop listening. That awareness became his way of staying alive, and in time, it turned into a kind of wisdom that could never be learned in books or towns. There were moments when he wondered if anyone would ever hear his story, if the lessons he'd learned would disappear with him when the mountain finally claimed him. But he never felt sadness about that. He believed the land itself remembered, that every fire, every footprint, every echo of a man's breath became part of its eternal memory, and that was he didn't need monuments or legacy. The mountain would hold his story in its silence, the same way it had held countless others. And yet, something deep inside him sensed that his story wasn't finished, that another test was coming, something to remind him that peace isn't a destination, but a balance that must be earned again and again. The first time the bear had come, it had been hunger that drove it. But when the second, years later, would be a test of everything he had learned about fear, patience, and coexistence, the mountain was always listening, always watching. And when it called, John was ready to, because a man who has learned to live in silence no longer fears the storm. He understands that every sound, even the growl of a bear at his, another voice, conversation of nature. And when that moment, the old oak door, it would be a symbol of all and all had learned. It began on a morning that felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't comfort but warn. The air was sharp, dry, and brittle, carrying the metallic scent that often comes before snow. John woke early, as he always did, stirred not by sound, but by instinct. The stove had gone out during the night, and the cabin was cold enough that his breath hung thick and ghostly in front of him. He dressed slowly, layering wool and canvas, listening for the familiar sounds outside, the river, the ravens, crackle of frozen trees. But there was nothing, just that heavy, waiting silence. He stepped outside, boots sinking into the crusted snow, and felt the stillness of the world pressing in from all directions. Even the air seemed to be holding its breath. That's saw the tracks, large and deliberate, circling the edge of the clearing. They were fresh, too fresh. He crouched to study them, running his gloved hand along the deep impression. The claws had dug so far into the snow that he could see the dark earth beneath. A bear, a big one. From the spacing of the, he could tell it was a heavy male, moving slow, purposeful, not wandering, hunting. John's heart began to drum in his chest, not in panic and awareness. The rhythm of survival he had learned from the mountain, every sense sharpened, every thought simplified. He knew what it meant when a bear appeared in late autumn. The berries were gone, the rivers had thinned to ice, and hunger was driving the creatures closer to where men lived. He followed the tracks a short distance just to understand their pattern. They led from the tree line to the side of his cabin, then circled back as though the animal had tested the place, found nothing easy, and left, but not far. John could see where the snow was disturbed a little way off, near a cluster of spruce. The bear had bedded down there, watching, waiting. He stood for a long moment, breathing slow, feeling the weight of the forest pressing on. He had survived one bear before, years ago. He knew how unpredictable, how their power crushed through walls and reason alike. But this time felt different. This wasn't a random, and the mountain was testing him again, reminding him that peace, vigilance turns to weakness. He returned to the cabin, closing the heavy oak door behind him. He ran his hand along its surface, feeling the rough scars from the last attack, the deep grooves where claws had once dug in, the faint dent where the wood had caught and held. That door had already saved his life, and somehow he knew it might have to do so again. He spent the next few hours checking everything. The rifle was clean, the latch secure, the small window boards reinforced. He stacked extra wood by the stove, filled the lanterns, and laid his axe within reach. Then he waited. Waiting is its own kind of endurance. Out there, time slows when danger lurks nearby. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind sounds like movement. John sat near the fire listening. He tried to steady his breathing, tried to remember that fear, if left unchecked, feeds itself. He wrote a few words in his journal. He's back. The same silence as before. As the day faded into twilight, snow began to fall, soft and heavy, blanketing the forest in white. The wind picked up, moaning through the trees like some ancient song. Then, through that song, another sound joined in, faint at first, almost like imagination. A crunch, and another, slow, deliberate. The bear was moving again. John rose quietly, setting the journal aside. He took the rifle and stood by the door, his heartbeat steady, firm. The bear's steps drew closer until they stopped just beyond the wall. He could hear its breathing, a deep, rhythmic sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Then came the scrape of claws against the logs, a low growl, and finally the heavy thud of weight pressing against the cabin. The bear The door shuddered under the first impact. John could feel the wood flex, could hear the metal latch straining. He didn't move. He just waited. The rifle aimed, but his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Firing too soon would only make things worse. The bear's intelligence, something most underestimate, was on full display. It didn't charge blindly. It tested. It pushed, withdrew, listened. The second shove came harder, cracking one of the outer planks. John knew that if it kept going like this, even the oak might not hold. He thought quickly. The trap had worked once because of timing, because he had used the bear's own weight against it. He would have to do the same again, only better. He stepped back quietly, positioning himself behind the door. The bear growled again, its massive body brushing the frame. He could hear it sniffing near the edges, perhaps smelling the smoke, the salt, the faint human scent that drove its hunger mad. Then came the heavy sound of claws gripping the latch, prying. John's mind raced. The bear had learned from before. It was trying to tear, not push. He waited for the sound he needed, the deep exhale that comes just before a bear commits to full force. The moment he heard it, he moved. With a sudden pull, he yanked the door open just enough for the bear's shoulder to slip inside. Then, using all his strength and the leverage of his body, slammed it shut again, trapping the animal between the frame and the door, just as before. The impact shook the entire cabin. The roar that followed was deafening. The bear thrashed, claws tearing at the wood, the sound of splintering filling the small room like thunder. John held the latch with everything he had, bracing his foot against the wall. The bear pulled back, then lunged again, snapping the metal hinge. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the door would give way in. John fired once, not to kill, but to shock, the shot echoing through the walls, the bullet grazing the outer frame. The blast and the pain sent the bear reeling backward, freeing the door. It staggered, roaring in frustration, and then disappeared into the dark, the sound of breaking branches fading into the... For minutes, John didn't move. He stood there, his hands trembling, his breath shallow. The silence that follows thick, strange, almost peaceful. He knew better than to assume it was over. He re-bolted the door with whatever he could find, rope, nails, even an old metal bar he once used to hang tools. Then he sat by the fire again, rifle across his knees, and listened. The night stretched long. Twice he thought he heard movement, but it was only the wind. When dawn finally broke, he stepped outside carefully, the rifle raised. The snow was churned and bloody near the doorway. The tracks led away deep into the woods. The bear had survived, but it wouldn't be back. Not soon, at least. He should have felt relief, but what filled him instead was something else, a strange stillness, almost reverence. It wasn't triumph he felt. It was understanding the bear wasn't his enemy. It was a part of the same world he belonged to, a reflection of the wildness still lived inside. The fight wasn't against nature, but within it. He realized then that the trap, the door, the entire encounter wasn't just about survival. It was a kind of conversation, a lesson from the mountain, reminding him peace without strength is fragile, and strength without humility is dangerous. Later, when he repaired the damage, he didn't replace the door. He reinforced it, but kept the marks, the claw grooves, the cracks, the scars of the battle. They told a story, one that belonged not just to him, but to the land itself. He wrote that night in his journal, "The mountain tested again. I listened and I answered. We are even now." The next days passed in deep reflection. He spent long hours outside, following the tracks not to hunt, but to understand. The trail led far, past the frozen creek, up toward the ridge where the trees thinned, the snow lay untouched. There he found signs of the bear resting, recovering. He didn't follow further. Instead, he stood for a while, looking out at the sky was the color of pale smoke, the sun hidden behind a thin veil of cloud. He felt an odd connection to that creature, a bond born of confrontation and respect. They had both survived the same winter, both fighting for their place in the same world. It was then that he discovered something unexpected, a den half buried under a fallen tree. Inside, faint tracks led to a smaller shape. He understood at once. The bear hadn't returned. It had returned to protect or hunger. The realization hit him with quiet force. What he had thought of as an attack had been an act of defense. The mother, for it must have been a female, had seen the cabin as a threat to her young. The first time years ago, perhaps it had been the same bear, and now she had come again, remembering this place as danger. In that moment, all the pieces fell into place. The careful testing, the hesitation, the way it had avoided killing blows. It wasn't hatred that had driven it. It was instinct, the same instinct that kept John alive. He stood there for a long time, watching the den, then quietly turned back toward his cabin. He felt no fear now, only understanding. He left food nearby, fish, dried meat, not as charity, but as an offering of peace. The next day, it was gone. The tracks led away and did not return. From that day on, the silence around his home felt different. It was deeper, but softer, like a truce had been signed between him and the wild. He had faced death twice and been spared not by luck, but by respect, a word that in the mountains carries the same weight as prayer. When he sat by the fire that night, he didn't write much. Only one line filled the page. The door protected me again, but the lesson was heard. He knew then that his time on the mountain was no longer about survival. It was about understanding his place in the vast, intricate balance of life and wilderness. The door, the bear, the silence, all of it was the same conversation spoken in different languages. Out here, everything speaks if you learn how to listen. And if you're still listening to this story, if something in it stirs that same hunger for simplicity, for stillness, for truth, don't ignore it. Subscribe and stay close, because stories like this don't come from imagination. They come from the quiet corners of the world where men and mountains meet, and where the old lessons of life are still whispered by the wind. The days that followed the bear's second visit passed an unusual calm. The mountain seemed quiet, as if both man and nature had reached silent understanding. The air felt different, lighter somehow, though the cold had deepened, the kind of cold that settles not only in the air, but in the bones. The snow glistened harder, the river sang softer beneath its frozen skin, and even the raven circled as if watching respectful. John spent those days mending the door, though this time no sense of urgency, no trembling. He worked slowly, his movements deliberate, every going through the stillness like heartbeat. He wasn't fixing a barrier anymore. He was preserving a memory. Each mark on that door told a story of fear, of instinct, of survival, and of the fragile truce that exists between man and wild. As he worked, he found himself thinking not about the bear, but about people, the world he had left behind years ago. He wondered how it had changed, if it had changed at all. He imagined the city still pulsing with lights and movement, people still chasing after things that faded too quickly. He thought about how noise had replaced meaning there, how speed had become a kind of blindness. Out here, every sound had value, every movement meant something. He realized that in the city, people didn't listen anymore, not to each other, not to themselves, not to the world that sustains them. The silence of the mountain had taught him that listening is the most powerful act a man can learn. It is through listening that one begins to understand the truth thing. Sometimes he thought about the few people he had met before choosing solitude. A man from a nearby town once asked him why he would ever choose to live alone, so far from everything. John hadn't known how to answer then, but now, after all those years, he understood. It wasn't about isolation, escape. It was about returning to a way of being that humans once understood, when they still knew how to live with the land instead of on top of it. He saw now that the mountain hadn't taken him away from the world. It had brought him closer to it. Every tree, every gust of wind, every call of an unseen bird reminded him that life isn't something you conquer or control. It's something you join, something you receive to move within its rhythm rather than against it. He often thought of the bear as a mirror. It had come to him twice, and both times had reflected something he needed to learn. The first time, it had shown him fear and the instinct to survive. The second time, it had shown him understanding that even the fiercest battles can carry meaning. It wasn't strength that saved him either time. It was awareness, the same awareness that allows a bird to sense a storm before it comes, or a tree to shed its leaves before the frost. Humans have that sense too, but they drown it out with noise and distraction until they forget it exists. Alone on the mountain, John had found that sense again. He could feel the weather changing before it arrived, sense danger before it appeared, and most importantly, recognize peace when it was present. That realization changed everything. The mountain was no longer his refuge or his teacher. It had become his reflection. The wild had shaped him the way wind shapes stone, slowly, invisibly, but with undeniable permanence. His hands bore the proof, calloused, rough. His face had grown lean, marked by sun and cold, yet his eyes carried something new. They no longer searched outward for meaning. They looked inward, calm and steady, like the surface of a still lake. He knew that he would never return to the city, not because he couldn't, but because he no longer belonged there. Once a man learns to live with silence, he can never again live comfortably with noise. He thought often about what people call freedom. In the city, freedom meant choices, endless choices about things that didn't matter. Out here, freedom was something else entirely. It was the weight of responsibility, the understanding that every action had consequences. If you forgot to gather wood, you froze. If you hunted without respect, you starved. If you ignored the signs of weather, you paid for it. That was real freedom, not the absence of rules, but the direct connection between choice and result. It made life harder, but also truer. There was no pretending, no hiding behind excuses. The mountain didn't care for lies. It accepted only truth, and in that, John found a kind of peace that he never thought. He realized that most people fear silence because it forces them to confront themselves. When you strip away the noise, what's left is who you truly are, without titles, without masks, without distraction. The mountain had done that to him. It had peeled away everything unnecessary until all that remained was what was real. At first, that stripping felt like pain, but over time, it became liberation. He learned that solitude is not the absence of others. It is the presence of oneself. And once you find that, you can never really be lonely again. During one of his long walks along the frozen river, he came across his reflection in a patch of thawing ice. He barely recognized himself. The man staring back had a wild beard, weathered skin, and eyes that held a quiet intensity. But there was no sadness there, no longing, just acceptance. He smiled at his reflection, a small, tired smile, and thought about how strange it was that he had found himself by losing everything else. The world he'd left behind had taught him ambition. The mountain had taught him enoughness. When he returned to his cabin that evening, he built a fire and sat watching the flames dance in the stove. He thought about Laura and Emma again, not with pain, but with peace. He hoped they were happy, that his daughter had grown strong, that she had found her own way. He didn't wish for reunion anymore. He knew some distances are sacred, meant not to be closed, but respected. Life, he had learned, doesn't always bring people together. Sometimes it teaches them through separation. The love he felt for them had not faded. It had simply transformed. It had become quiet, steady, like the glow of the fire that kept him warm at night. There were nights when the aurora borealis painted the sky, waves of green and blue shimmering above the trees. He would step outside then, wrapped in fur and silence, and watch the heavens move. The sight never failed to humble him. It reminded him that he was part of something vast, something eternal. Those lights, dancing silently across the sky, had been seen by men for thousands of years. Hunters, wanderers, hermits, all had looked up and felt what he was feeling now: awe, gratitude, and the deep understanding that we are small but not insignificant. In those moments, he felt connected not only to the land, but to every soul that had ever sought truth in solitude. He began to think of life in simpler terms. To him, happiness was no longer a pursuit, but a condition of alignment, when what you do, what you need, and what you love all point in the same direction. Out here, everything aligned. The struggle, the quiet, the hunger, the peace, they all formed a single, seamless existence. He didn't need more. He didn't crave less. He simply was, and that was enough. Sometimes he wondered what would happen when his body could no longer endure the winters, when his strength would fade, but the thought didn't trouble him. He had seen how the forest dealt with age, decay, and nothing was wasted, nothing was lost. Everything returned to the earth to nourish what came. He found comfort in that idea. Death, to him, was not an ending, but a continuation, a return to the same silence that had once frightened him. He no longer feared it. If anything, he respected it as the final, the one that comes when all others have finished their work. The bear never returned again, but sometimes he thought he heard her in the distance, a low echo carried by the wind. When that happened, he would smile softly and whisper into the cold, "I remember." He no longer saw her as a threat or a test. She had become part of his understanding, a living reminder of the fragile harmony between power and restraint. When he looked at the world through that lens, everything changed. He realized that people often seek control because they fear chaos. But the wilderness had shown him that control is an illusion. True balance comes not from domination, coexistence. He no longer wanted to control a mountain. He wanted to serve it, to live within its rhythm. And in doing so, he had discovered the purest form of strength, the kind that doesn't fight against life, but flows with it. As he sat by the fire that night, watching the shadows flicker on cabin walls, he realized that his story wasn't one of survival at all. It was a story of surrender, not to weakness, but to truth. He had come to the mountain to escape the world, but in the end, he had found the world here in its most honest form. The simplicity of a flame, the wisdom of silence, the beauty of impermanence. These were the things that mattered. And if you've been following this story, if something in it makes you pause and think about your own life, maybe it's because the mountain is calling you too. Not to pack your bags and disappear, but to listen, to stop. even for a moment, and hear the quiet voice beneath all the noise. That's where truth begins. That's where peace hides. And if you want to keep walking that path, stay close, because the story still has one final thing to teach: the silence and the legacy it leaves behind. The winters grew heavier as the years went on, though John no longer counted them. The days and nights had become one continuous flow of light and shadow, cold and warmth, work and rest. He moved slower now, his body bearing the cost of years spent in the wild, but his spirit felt lighter than it ever had before. The mountain, once a challenge to conquer, had become an old friend, firm, patient, and unyielding in its honesty. He often thought about how strange it was that the very place that could kill him so easily had given him more life than anything else ever In that had. Balance between danger and peace, he had discovered the essence of what it means to live fully, to accept everything, even the hard and the uncertain, as part of a larger harmony. His beard had turned white, and his hands, though still strong, trembled slightly when he worked with small tools. But he continued to mend, carve, to build, to move with the rhythm that had defined his existence for so long. The cabin had aged with him. The wood had darkened, the roof slightly, and the scars of the door, those deep, ragged marks, had weathered into the grain as if they had always been there. Sometimes, when he ran his fingers over them, he could almost hear the echo of that long-ago roar, the sharp crack of wood, the sound of his own heart pounding. But now, those sounds no longer stirred. They stirred gratitude. Each scar was a reminder that he had lived through moments when life could have ended, and yet it hadn't. The mountain had allowed him to stay, and in return, he had given it his respect, his effort, and his silence. As the seasons passed, he began to sense that his time there was nearing its end, though not in any tragic or sorrowful way. It was simply a feeling, the same kind of instinct that guided him all those years, the subtle knowing everything has its season. The animals around him seemed to know it too. The fox that sometimes visited grew bolder, sitting closer by the firelight outside. The ravens followed him more often on his walks, their black wings glinting against the snow. Even the river seemed to sing softer, as if it understood that the man who had listened to it for so long was beginning to fade back into the same silence that had once welcomed him. He spent more time sitting by the window, watching the snow. Sometimes he would write, though his journal had fewer words now. The sentences had grown shorter, simpler, clearer. Fire steady, river frozen, heart calm. That was how his entries looked near the end. He no longer needed to explain things. He no longer sought understanding. He simply observed, accepting everything as it came. One morning, he woke before dawn, as he always had. The world outside was covered in new snow, untouched and flawless. He stepped outside, the cold biting at his skin, the sky pale with the promise of sunrise. He took a long breath and looked at the valley below. The same valley he had walked for years, the same ridges and rivers that had shaped him. Everything was quiet, perfect still, as if the entire mountain was holding that moment for him. He whispered softly, "Thank you," though there was no one to hear it but the wind. He sat down on the old wooden bench by the cabin wall, the one he had built during his second summer. His breath rose in small clouds, disappearing into the morning air. He thought of Laura, of Emma, of the life he had once lived, the life he wondered if his daughter ever thought of him, if she had grown to understand that her father hadn't left out of selfishness, but out of a deep, unexplainable need to find truth. Maybe one day when she was older, she would. Maybe she would even come here, follow the path through the trees, and find the cabin waiting. The thought brought him peace. He didn't hope for it. He simply knew that if it was meant to happen, it would. The mountain had its own way of bringing things full circle. That day stretched on longer. The light lingered on the snow, turning everything to gold. The air was so clear he could see the farthest peaks, their edges cutting the horizon like stone blades. He spent the afternoon splitting a little wood, patching a crack in the stove, and feeding the birds that came to peck near the door. When the sun began to set, he built one last fire, larger than usual, letting it fill the cabin with warmth and light. He cooked a small meal, fish, potatoes, and the last of his preserved berries, and ate slowly, savoring every bite as though tasting time itself. That night, the aurora came again, brighter than he had ever seen it. The sky rippled in waves of green and violet, moving like a living thing. John stepped outside once more, wrapped in his heavy coat, and stood beneath it. He felt small, but not insignificant, a single flicker in the endless rhythm of the universe. He watched the light until his neck ached from looking upward, then smiled, a quiet, content smile that needed no audience. He whispered to the night. The next morning, when the sun rose, the fire had burned low, the tools were neatly arranged, and the journal sat open on the table. On its final page were only a few words. The mountain gave me peace. I gave it my silence. Outside, the snow was untouched, except for a few fox tracks leading to the door and away again. The world had continued as it always, gently folding the man's life into its own. When spring came and the ice on the river cracked open, the cabin still stood, weathered, strong, timeless. Travelers who passed through sometimes stopped there, drawn by the smoke-stained walls and the feeling of calm that hung in the air. They would find the journal, read a few pages, and leave something behind. A coin, a note, a carved stone. Over the years, the place became known quietly to trappers and wanderers as the Door Cabin, named for that scarred oak door that had once stood between a man and a bear and had somehow become a symbol of endurance and understanding. Those who stayed there for a night often said the same thing, that the silence felt alive, almost as if the mountain itself was listening. Some swore they heard faint footsteps outside at dawn, or the slow creak of the door moving in the wind, but none ever felt it. The place carried not loneliness. It was as if the mountain had absorbed the man's spirit and was keeping it there, watching over anyone who dared to stay long enough to listen. Years later, when Emma was grown, she did find her way there, not by searching, but by chance. Though in the wilderness, chance often feels like something more. She came with a small group of hikers, following an old map marked by someone long gone. When she saw the cabin, she stopped. Something about it pulled at her, the way certain places do when they remember you. She stepped inside and found the journal on the table, its pages filled with her father's handwriting. She read for hours, her breath shaking as she turned the last page. The fire she built that night burned high, and as she sat there in the same silence that had once surrounded him, finally stood. The next morning, she placed a small carved stone on the windowsill, one her father had given her when she was a child, and whispered, "I found you." The wind outside shifted slightly, brushing against the door with a sound almost like a sigh. She smiled through her tears, closed the journal gently, and left the cabin just as she had found it. The mountain, in its quiet way, had brought them together after all. Over time, snow and moss slowly covered the roof, the logs aged to gray, and the forest crept closer, as it always does. But the cabin never truly disappeared. The people who found it, hunters, travelers, dreamers, kept its story alive. They spoke of the man who had lived there in peace, the man who had turned his cabin door into a bear trap twice, and who had learned from both encounters that survival is not about conquest, but coexistence. The legacy he left wasn't written in stone or carved into monument. It lived in whisper, in the silence between breaths, in the soft awareness that somewhere in the heart of Alaska, a cabin still stands, holding the memory of a man who found truth in solitude. And maybe when the wind moves just right across the valley, carrying the scent of pine and snow, you can still hear it. The faint creak of an old oak door, the voice of the mountain saying soft, "Peace is possible, you're willing." So, if you've made it this far, if you've felt that stillness while reading, Don't let it fade. Let it remind you pause, to listen, to find your own. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and share this story with someone who needs a little quiet in their world. Because somewhere out there, in every one of us, there's a mountain waiting, and sometimes all it takes to find it is to stop and listen.